Welcome back to Final Fantasy. Just a quick recap of what's going on in case anybody forgot or weren't paying attention previously, or maybe I overlooked mentioning something or didn't make something clear, or maybe this is the first episode you're watching even though it's episode 2. Anyway, where we last left off, we have a bunch of quests to complete for various people that we've met. We need to find Matoya's crystal eye. Apparently she can't see without it and somebody evidently stole it. We need to get the herb to heal the Prince of Elfland or Elfheim, whichever. It, I think, depends on which version of the game you're playing. I believe in this original version it's called Elfland, but then later versions change it to Elfheim, I think. Whatever the case, we need to get that, so we need to get the herb so we can heal the Prince of the Elf place from a sleep spell that an evil elf named Astos put him under. We also need to find TNT because there's a dwarf named Derek, I believe, who is trying to build a canal, and he requires dynamite to finish his project. So we need to give that for him. And there's also a king who we technically haven't met. I don't remember if I actually bothered to go and speak with him in this run. Like I said before, this footage was recorded over a year ago for me to do this. So I don't remember if I actually bother talking to that king to give context to what's going on. Normally I don't, because I already know where to go, so usually I just skip bothering going up there. But there's a king in a castle who wants us to get him the crown, which is located in the Marsh Cave. And that's the next place, well, the next major place we'll be going is the Marsh Cave to the southwest of Elfland to get the crown and take it to that king. So that's what we're going to probably be mostly doing today. I don't know how long that will take. The Marsh Cave is difficult. It usually takes a while, and I usually have to enter and leave a couple times. I have sort of a method to how I like to do that dungeon usually, though. Aside from getting maybe to level 2 before going to the Temple of Fiends to fight Garland at the beginning, I usually don't like to grind in this game, at least not deliberately so, or in most older RPGs. I usually prefer, like if I'm at a dungeon and I need to get stronger, instead of just walking around in circles grinding until I feel like I'm strong enough, like a lot of people probably do and how I used to when I was younger. I don't really like doing that. I prefer to actually go to the dungeon or wherever it is I'm supposed to go, get as far into it as possible, gathering information, figuring out the lay of the dungeon if I'm not familiar with it already from playing the game previously, get treasure chests, essentially make some progress while also getting stronger. Then when I feel like I can't push any further, I will leave the dungeon, go back to town, heal up at the inn, restock on items, maybe buy some stronger gear if I have the money to do so. Then I will go back to the dungeon, more well prepared because I might be a level or 2 higher, but also I will probably have more equipment, so I'll have higher stats because of my gear. I might have more items to heal myself to be able to last longer, and I'll also have a better idea of where I need to go in the dungeon if I don't already have the map memorized from past playthroughs. And I will also have already opened some of the treasure chests, so there will be fewer detours that I need to be concerned with as I am trying to get through it, so I can focus more on either taking different detours or just working my way towards the final goal. And that's usually how I prefer to play these older games nowadays. Back when I was younger, I would sit there and deliberately grind. I would stand right outside of a town, walk around in circles until I felt I was strong enough to get through the next dungeon all in one go. Or just until I'd bought all the new spells, weapons, and armors and all that stuff at the latest town. Because I felt like once I had done that, that was kind of the game's way of telling me, okay, now I am about at the level and strength I should be to move on, because I have all of the new up-to-date stuff. So, for those of you who are just joining us for this series, either introduced to it right now or whatever, this is not a conventional playthrough of this game. I recorded this some time ago, like I said earlier in this episode already, over a year ago. It was last summer when I recorded this footage. And I wanted to do it with the idea of being able to make more smooth progress as the game progresses, and being able to focus more on things that I want to talk about while the game is going, as opposed to normally playing through while commentating simultaneously, and I would have to worry about my attention being divided between what I'm trying to talk about and what's happening in the game. This way I can just focus much more on what I want to say while the game is just happening, because I already recorded it while focused 100% on the game, allowing for smoother progress and fewer issues as a result of divided concentration. Just something I wanted to try out for this. Do something a little bit different, at least different from what I've done before. So because of that, there's not going to be much reactionary dialogue. I have the footage running in front of me, watching it back as I'm talking, but I'm only half paying attention to it. So maybe I'll react to things or comment on things that are happening, maybe I won't. It'll depend on how much I'm actually focusing on the footage, and if anything interesting happens. There's also going to be a lot less cuts and editing in this than I would normally do. Usually I would cut out a lot of content, especially if I'm not having a lot to say or there's some dead air. I'll cut out stuff, or I might try to condense my commentary a little bit to make room to cut out useless battles or instances where I'm just walking from point A to point B and nothing interesting is happening. None of that. The actual footage itself isn't going to be cut at all. There may occasionally be fades, like a fading transition. If you see that, that's just because it's transitioning from one recording session to the next because obviously I didn't play through the entire game in one sitting. So each episode, I want to cover a particular topic. But before we get into today's topic, I want to elaborate a little bit more specifically on last episode's topic, most notably in regards to the characteristics and abilities of the Black Belt, because I don't think I covered that very well. I said that the Black Belt is strong unarmed and doesn't require much armor compared to other fighting classes, but I don't think I really clarified what that entails and how it really makes the Black Belt different from the other fighters mechanically speaking. So how this game works is typically your stats are determined very heavily by your weapons and your armor. I believe a character's damage output is normally I think they get like 1 attack power for every 2 points in strength or something like that. And if they don't have any weapons equipped, then their attack power is, I believe, just that. Just half of whatever their strength is. And then with armor or absorb, as this game calls it, your defensive abilities never increase. Well, your defensive ability for reducing damage never increases as you gain levels. Your evasiveness does for dodging attacks, but not your absorb for reducing damage from attacks. That is dictated entirely on the armor you have equipped. If you unequip all your armor, your absorb will be 0. This, however, is where the Black Belt differs from the other job classes. First of all, weirdly enough, even though the Black Belt's whole thing is hitting things, his strength stat I don't think does anything. No matter how much his strength goes up, his damage output will not increase from that. Because his nunchuck weapons, I don't believe are affected by strength. I believe each nunchuck just has a set amount of damage that it has, regardless of the Black Belt's stats. So it's more like how armor functions for those specific weapons, or at least weapons equipped to the Black Belt. Instead, how the Black Belt's strength works is if he does not have a weapon equipped, then his attack power will be twice the value of his level. So currently, I think my characters are, I think it said level 5. So if I unequipped the Black Belt's weapons, his attack power would be 10. And they also attack more times. The number of times they attack, 5. So it would be 10 attack power. And how attacking works is as your accuracy goes up, every 32 points in accuracy your character has, they can perform an additional hit in combat. Right now my characters are only hitting once because they only have because their accuracy isn't high enough. But once, say, our fighter hits 32 accuracy, then each time he attacks, he'll have a chance of hitting up to 2 times, increasing the likelihood of him getting damage in at all, while also increasing the amount of damage he can deal if he's able to hit multiple times. In the Black Belt's case, however, if he does not have a weapon equipped, then that value is doubled. So eventually, you don't want a weapon equipped on your Black Belt because they'll just be dealing more damage without it. Their attack strength will surpass the strength they get from their nunchucks, especially because there's only 2 nunchucks in the entire game, so they're never very strong. but also he'll be hitting twice as many times each time he attacks. And similarly with his Absorb, the Black Belt's Absorb stat, when he doesn't have any armor equipped, you have to unequip all of his armor to achieve this effect. And if you do so, instead, unlike every other job class where without any armor their Absorb is 0, in the Black Belt's case, if the Black Belt has nothing equipped, then his Absorb becomes equal to his level. And that can free up some inventory space as well, because each character can only hold up to 4 weapons and 4 pieces of armor. And if everybody's full on that, that's it. Your standard inventory cannot carry weapons and armor. So there's a bit of inventory management there, especially if you're in the middle of a dungeon and your inventories are full. You have to start dropping stuff if you want to get new equipment from treasure chests. But the Black Belt can help mitigate that a little bit without losing nearly as much of his survivability because of a loss of armor. Generally speaking, though, while you do eventually want to have the Black Belt not holding any weapons to maximize his damage, unless you're excessively leveling up, it's usually better for the Black Belt to have armor equipped, because the Absorb you're getting from armor is going to almost always exceed the defense you'll get by being unarmed, unless you're over-leveled. And I just know, and see, like I said, I'm not really paying that close attention. I just noticed that our fighter has 32 accuracy, so maybe he's already been hitting twice. And I just haven't been paying attention. Or maybe it was 34? But I'm pretty sure it's every 32 accuracy. But like I said, I'm not paying that close of attention. But I don't feel like you usually have 2 hits already at level 5. But maybe I'm mistaken. I don't use the fighter very often. I feel like the fighter is way too overpowered, so it's not a job I usually use. So I just wanted to go over that stuff with the Black Belt real quick before we moved on to today's main topic. So today, for today's topic, I wanted to go over a bit of my history with the Final Fantasy series, just in general. Any exposure to the series or stories throughout my life involving the series that come to mind. I've taken a few notes of things that I just thought of idly from time to time since we last recorded one of these. And I'm just gonna basically wing it based on that topic. It might get a bit rambly, it might get a bit weird. Well, not weird in a weird sense, I mean weird as in... what do I mean by that? Whatever. Basically, it might not always feel very structured, or it might feel like I'm rambling or going back and forth or jumping around. This isn't very well planned out. It's very candid. with some plans, but nothing extremely concrete or whatever. It's not like scripted or anything like that. Like I said, I have some notes of stories that I thought of that might come up. But I guess let's finally get into that. And obviously the starting point for that would be my introduction to Final Fantasy, which is actually my introduction to turn-based RPGs as a whole. And I'm pretty sure technically the very first time I ever played an RPG was this game. But played is kind of a stretch in that context. My mother and my aunt, when I was growing up especially, would basically have yearly garage sales. They would always have these garage sales every summer. And they were usually at my house. I think sometimes they're at my aunt's house, but usually they're at my house. I think it was just a better location. I think it was just a better location. My aunt's house at the time was kind of off the beaten path, per se. It was like hidden on a side road behind a bunch of trees, if I recall correctly. So it seems like it would be a place that a lot of people would pass by and not even know it was there. And I can assume that's why the garage sales were never over there. And my cousin, who is much older than I am, at those garage sales, he would oftentimes put out video games that he didn't want anymore and he was going to sell at the garage sales. And I would always go out there and look through those games, see which ones there were, and if there were any that I liked, I would take the games inside, try them out for a bit, and if I liked them, I would tell my aunt that I wanted them and she would let me have them. I assume I never had to pay for those, but I assume either my mom or my aunt just gave my cousin the money he wanted for them. That's how I assume those transactions happened. And I got a lot of games that I really, really liked from that. I believe that's how I got Wheel of Fortune for the NES. I believe that's how I got Air Fortress, Guardian Legend, Adventures in the Magical Kingdom. So there were some great NES games I was exposed to because of that. And I believe one year, one of those games was Final Fantasy. So I took this game into my room to try it out, knowing absolutely nothing about it. I didn't even know what an RPG was. I'd never even heard of turn-based video games aside from board game games like Monopoly, the video game, or the aforementioned Wheel of Fortune. I never in my wildest imagination imagined the idea of something like this. Something that's such a grand adventure. Well, I would have known about grand adventures. By the time I played this, I had probably played Zelda, but that wasn't a turn-based game where you have a party of people. And I remember I never got past the character creation screen. Knowing what I knew about video games at that time, I probably saw the character creation screen, thought it was some sort of stage select like in Mega Man, and couldn't figure out how to select anything on it. So after about like 2 or 3 minutes of not being able to figure out this weird screen, I just shut the game off and took it back out to the garage sale. Then, some number of years later, I don't remember how long, I don't remember how old I was when I had that first exposure. Probably partly because it was such a random and not forgettable experience, but it was an inconsequential one because of how dumb I thought the game was, because I couldn't even figure out how to start it. And I probably didn't click continue because I would have seen that and probably just assumed it meant input a password. Or maybe there was no save file on it. Maybe the save file had been erased because it got corrupted or something. I actually have a story about that. Hang on. Do I have that on my notes? Yes, I do have that in my notes. Because I don't want to bring it up quite yet, but I also don't want to forget it. So... So the very... Actually, you know what? Screw it. Let's just talk about that now since it came up. So the save file might have been corrupted. I don't know. And that actually goes into one thing I wanted to talk about, which was the very first time I beat this game. And the very first time I quote-unquote had a ROM of a game under the stipulations that were always listed on all the websites and all that stuff. Because like most people, I was super into ROMs and emulation in the 90s once I discovered it. Especially for playing games that never release outside Japan. That's usually what I played on those. I played things like Feta, Emblem of Justice, Dual Orb 2, stuff like that. Probably some platformers. Final Fantasy III on the NES. Just stuff like that. I even played some really weird games that nobody ever brings up. Like Gundam F91, which was some weird space shooter game. Getting back on topic, there was a point in time when I owned this game on the NES, and I was playing through it, and it was the furthest I'd ever gotten. I'd never really gotten all that far into this game. Especially because when I was younger in particular, heck, even nowadays, I hate not knowing where I'm supposed to go in video games. Nowadays, I'm much more willing to explore and try and figure out where to go. But back when I was younger, I couldn't stand not knowing where to go. In fact, that's actually one reason why I don't like open world games. Because there's too much freedom of where to go, rather than the game telling you this is where you're supposed to go. But that's getting way off topic. The point is, I only ever got so far in this game because, when I was playing through this game when I was much younger, I was using the guide that comes in the instruction manual. And it tells you where to go, gives you tips on doing things, gives you all the information of like what all the spells do and all that stuff. So I was always following that guide. And once you get to a certain point in the game, which is the point in the game when it most opens up, as far as exploring the world and figuring out where to go, the guide just stops. And because the game at that point didn't tell me explicitly precisely where I was supposed to go, I just stopped playing. I didn't want to have to figure out where to go. I just wanted to know where to go. Either from a guide or because the game's story told me. And I've had similar situations in the past as well with games. In Tales of Eternia for the PlayStation, from what I recall in that game, I was really enjoying it. But then you get to a point where you get this ability where they like lets you cross oceans or something, and it's just like, okay, the entire world is basically now open to you. Now set forth. And it didn't tell me where to go, so I stopped playing. Because it was leaving me up to me to explore and figure out where to go, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted the story to tell me through its natural dialogue and storytelling where I needed to go next. And this game did the same thing. It just didn't tell me where to go once I hit that point, so I just didn't want to continue playing. Another game that I played where I didn't have that problem was Breath of Fire on the Super Nintendo. That game's instruction manual also had a guide. But in that game, I never felt lost afterwards, because even when I got to the end of the guide, I feel like the game's story was still nudging me in the right direction, telling me where I was supposed to go, so I didn't mind no longer having the guide in that game. Whereas in something like this, it was completely blind, unless you had the guide. And here we are at the Marsh Cave, where we are supposed to go to get the crown for the king that we didn't visit. So we don't know that, but we do know that. And this dungeon is quite the difficulty spike as far as this game goes. This is probably one of the toughest points in the game if you don't know what you're doing, because of just how much stronger some of these enemies suddenly become, and how ill-prepared you can be for this place if you didn't come when you were ready. Anyway, getting back on the main topic. So, for a long time, because of that, I never got particularly far in this game until one day I bought it, probably used at Funko Land or something, back when retro games were dirt cheap because nobody wanted them. And I was playing through it, and this time I actually wanted to beat the game. This was the very first time I ever got far in it. All previous times I played the game, I never got past that point where the instruction manual's guide stops, because I didn't want to figure out what to do. But this time, I was more experienced and more comfortable with RPGs and the idea of exploring and figuring out and actually needing to figure out where to go without it just being told to me. So I was giving the game a try, and I got really far. I made it all the way to the final dungeon, and I was grinding for it. I didn't know how strong I needed to be, but I also sucked at RPGs back then, to the point where Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is the most beginner RPG in existence, and even that game, well, I considered Final Fantasy Mystic Quest at that time to be a worthy challenge. So for people who are familiar with Mystic Quest, that's how bad I was at RPGs back then. So I was grinding for the final dungeon, getting however ready I thought I needed to get. I don't know what level I wanted to get to. I might have even asked a friend what a good level would be. I don't know. The point is, one day while I was grinding to do that, the game froze. And when I started it back up, my save file was gone. It got corrupted and deleted from the game freezing. So, I went to emulation. I downloaded the ROM for this game and replayed through the entire thing on an emulator, probably with help from some things like frame skip and maybe save states. So I did that, and I kept the cartridge the entire time, because there were always those websites. A lot of ROM sites back then would be like, oh, ROMs are illegal to own or to have on your computer unless you own the actual cartridge. So, like, as acknowledgement of that or whatever, I kept the cartridge until I beat the game on the emulator, and that run, I beat it. I finally beat the game, and then I went to Funko Land the next day or a few days later or whatever, and traded in the game because I felt like I would never want to play the game on actual hardware again after that incident with my save file occurred. Because that was some bogus crap right there. Getting a bit back, well, not getting back on topic, but getting back to how I wanted to start this conversation before I went off on a tangent about something that was supposed to come up later, or at least I planned on coming up later. My introduction to Final Fantasy and turn-based RPGs in general. Sometime after that first experience with this game, again, don't remember how many years it was, I met a friend who had some experience with RPGs. He owned Final Fantasy VI, which at that time we knew as Final Fantasy III, for the Super Nintendo. And I remember before I had seen the game, it was shortly after we met. We were talking on the bus. We actually met kind of at random, kind of deliberately. From what he told, he was actually out looking for friends because he had just moved to the area. And so he was riding his bike just out and about. I believe he said at that time or later on that he was actually out on his bike looking for kids his own age, hoping to make some friends, and he saw me literally up the street. We lived half a street from each other. He lived at the far end of the street, like right across from where I lived, pretty much. And I just happened to be outside playing with my Z-Bots when he came by on his bike, and he saw me. He recognized me because we were both in the same class. It was 5th grade at the time. And so he rides up the driveway. I see him, I recognize him as well, and he asks if he can play with me because he just sees me playing with these toys, and he asks if he can join me, and I'm like, sure. And then we just kind of became friends from there. So one day on the bus, when we're heading home from school, we would have had the same bus stop, but I believe he always got a ride from his mom going to school or something. Or maybe I did that. Something like that. But, so one day on the way home from school on the bus, we're talking about video games and stuff, and he starts talking about Final Fantasy VI. He's not being very specific about the details, though, which left me kind of confused about things because, as I said, I'd never seen, heard of, or even conceived the idea of this kind of game before. And I specifically remember him mentioning his characters' levels and what level his characters were at in the game. And in my head, I didn't understand what that meant. When he said levels, I thought he meant stages in the game. So in my head, I envisioned this 2D platformer. I just get into the game real quick, kind of going on what I brought up before. Like I said, I like to do dungeons in a lot of these games kind of systematically. Going in, getting some stuff, leaving, healing, buying new stuff, going back stronger, and that's what I did here. This is how I usually like to do the Marsh Cave, is I like to go north first, get the treasure chests in that room, then leave, and then come back stronger. Then the next time try to do the whole thing, or if not, the time after that I should usually be able to clear it. But back to the story. He was telling me about this game, and when he mentioned all the characters' levels and that they were all at different levels, I interpreted that as levels or stages in a game like Super Mario Brothers or Mega Man. So in my head, what I envisioned from this description he was giving me about his characters was that this was some weird platformer where you had multiple characters that you could swap between. Maybe kind of like Super Mario Brothers 2 or something. But instead of every character sharing progression, they all have to advance through the levels individually. So when he said, like, this character is at level 12, this character is at level 13, I thought that that's how far each character was, or how far he'd gotten with each of those characters into the game. Because I'd never seen a game like this before where your characters actually got stronger as you played, aside from, again, things like Zelda. But even Zelda, you're not getting stronger because you're gaining levels, you're getting stronger because you're getting new stuff. So I didn't know what to think of that. Well, I thought I knew what to think of it, but it turned out I was completely wrong, obviously. So at some point after that, I go to his house and I'm actually able to see this game. And it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I tried it out and hang on. So I go over to his house and I see this game and I try it out, and one battle was all it took. And ever since that day, way back when I was like 11 years old, turn-based RPGs have been my favorite genre of video game. I became completely fascinated and loved this idea of having a party of characters that you're controlling simultaneously instead of just one guy like in every other game I'd ever played. And also the idea of fighting using strategy and all these different options and abilities, instead of having to use reflexes and skill that you need in your typical platformer. So, yeah, it blew my mind, and I immediately fell in love with the game and the genre as a whole. So that's how I discovered Final Fantasy and RPGs and my lifelong love for the genre. And I was especially obsessed with the Final Fantasy series at that time. I don't remember exactly which ones I played in what order after that. The next Final Fantasy game I played would have been either Final Fantasy III on the NES through emulation, or Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo, which at that time we knew here in the States as Final Fantasy II because of that whole nonsense with the numbering of those games. And while Final Fantasy IV isn't all that interesting, really, Uh... Actually, at that time, for a long while, Final Fantasy IV actually had my favorite story in the entire series. Final Fantasy IV's story is dumb, but I think I liked it because I don't know, I think it just was more appealing to me when I was young because of how simple it is, or like it doesn't have a whole lot of character depth. It's more just about the fantastical journey that the characters are on, and a lot of really dumb, really contrived, and really forced plot twists that, as a dumb kid, I thought were amazing. That's not to say Final Fantasy IV has a bad story, it's just really dumb in a lot of ways. Or it does a lot of things that don't really pay off, or exist as plot twists for no other reason than to be a plot twist. But I loved it when I was younger. Final Fantasy III, on the other hand, that game, I didn't know what was going on. Because at that time, I don't think there was a complete English translation for the game. Or at the very least, I never found one. The version I played at that time for Final Fantasy III, all of the menus and items and weapons, spells, all the stuff you needed to play the game was in English, so the game was perfectly playable in that sense. But all of the character dialogue, that was only translated up through the first town. Once you leave the first town, I think a lot of the games still used English letters, but they were all just a jumbled mess. There was no coherency or actual words in any of it. It was just a bunch of gobbledygook. I got through the game, though, because of GameFAQs. I downloaded a walkthrough of the game and used that. And back then, I was perfectly okay with that, because I didn't care what was going on in a game. Nowadays, I would probably get bored with the game after a few hours, because I don't know the story, I don't know what's going on, I don't know the driving force of what I'm doing, or anything like that. But back then, I didn't care. When I was younger, this is actually something I covered when I was playing Shining Force. But when I was younger, I didn't care about the story in RPGs at all. To the point where I sincerely believed the only reason RPGs even had a story was to tell you where you're supposed to go next. And everything else built around it was just a bunch of useless fluff to waste your time. So playing through Final Fantasy III, I didn't really care that I didn't know what was going on. If anything, that made the game more fun, because it gave me an excuse to just use a walkthrough to know exactly where I needed to go at all times, while also giving me insight as to, say, what level I should be for a thing, or if I should be using a specific job class for a specific dungeon. Which is actually really useful information for that game in particular, because of how it's structured. On top of that, it allowed me to be able to progress through the game more quickly because I could just skip all the dialogue. I didn't have to bother reading it because I couldn't read it. So I didn't have to deal with that annoying aspect of the game as it would have been to me at that time. I could just get through the dialogue, use the walkthrough to tell me where to go next, and just focus on the gameplay. And that opinion of RPGs actually persisted until some number of years later when I played Final Fantasy Tactics for the very first time on the PlayStation. That game is structured a little bit differently. For those of you who don't know, the overworld in that game, it's a point-and-click interface. You have a cursor and you click on destinations to tell your guy where to go. And there's always a red indicator to tell you where you're supposed to go next. Because of that, I thought the story was pointless. I sincerely believed there was no point in Final Fantasy Tactics even having a story because the game showed you with visual cues and indicators where you needed to go. And since I didn't need to read the dialogue to know where to go, there's no point in the story even existing, so I would always skip all the dialogue in that game. I didn't care. It just annoyed the hell out of me that it's wasting my time with useless dialogue when I don't need it to know where to go. And some of the talking bits in that game are long. There's a lot of talking, a lot of reading in that game. And it's the one thing I hated about it. Despite loving everything else, I hated how much dialogue there was when the dialogue served absolutely no purpose in my mind. That is, until I got partway through Chapter 2. I don't remember exactly how far along I was, but I'm pretty sure it was Chapter 2. And right there we just saw one of those transitions I mentioned before, meaning we're moving on to a new recording session. So in this episode and in any future episodes, if you see that transition, that means it's a new recording session. It doesn't mean anything as far as the episodes go, necessarily, but I just want you to be aware of that. So if you see that transition happen, that's why it happened. So you have some context and understand the reason behind it. As opposed to another game where if I were doing this more in real time, the transition or the cut would be for reasons of actual cutting rather than that sort of necessity. Anyway, where was I? The Final Fantasy Tactics thing. Chapter 2, right. So I was at some point in Chapter 2, and I realized for some reason I was getting bored of the game. I didn't get it at first because the game was so much fun, but I was getting bored with it. And then at some point, it just occurred to me that the reason I was getting bored with the game is because I didn't know what was going on. There were all these characters, all this stuff happening, and I didn't know what it was. So I started reading the dialogue, actually reading it. Granted, there are some things I didn't really get because I skipped like a dozen hours worth of the dialogue in the game leading up to that point, or the dialogue's worth of a dozen hours or so of the game, not literally a dozen hours of reading. So I start reading it, the story, actually reading it now, and suddenly I'm enjoying the game again. And at that point, I had sort of an epiphany and realized that the story of a game, in fact, can matter outside of just needing to know where to go next. From then on, I started actually caring a lot more about the stories in games. It still took some time before I started talking much to NPCs. Nowadays, whenever I'm playing an RPG and I get to a new town, I'll usually talk to all the NPCs, not only to gather information, but also to get some context for what's going on. Some flavor text, if you will. But that I didn't do until later, because even though I had realized the importance of stories and enjoying an RPG, I still felt like NPCs in particular only existed to give you additional information on where you are supposed to go if you haven't figured it out yet, or if the story itself was a little bit vague on where to go, then the NPCs are there to point you in the right direction. And I never really thought about it as anything else until I met a friend years later, and he was playing Grandia 2 on the Dreamcast. It was my game, my Dreamcast, but he came over and was trying the game out, and he was talking to every single person in town. And I'm like, why are you wasting your time talking to these people? And we actually got into a little bit of a debate because he was saying, I'm talking to them. I don't remember his exact wording, but he basically said he was talking to them for flavor text, so he could have more context as to what's going on and know more about the world and immerse himself more into it. And I just thought that was stupid. I'm like, no, the point of NPCs is to talk to them if you're lost. And then he was saying, no, the point of NPCs is so you can immerse yourself deeper into the world. And we had a little bit of a debate over that. And that didn't convince me right then and there, but it put the idea in my head that I never considered before, which is that NPCs could be used as more than just guides on where you're supposed to go if you get lost, or if you maybe took a break from the game and you need a refresher on what's going on. Speaking of Final Fantasy Tactics, I think I'll go over one more of my notes before we end this episode. I want each episode in this series to be about an hour long, give or take some minutes. That's my goal anyway. And we have a lot more on this topic to discuss. So I have some more stories, some more experiences I'll be sharing next time. So this topic is not done yet. But since we're on the topic of Final Fantasy Tactics, I just want to bring up one quick experience with that game that I have written in my notes. And that's in association with a debug code. A friend and I discovered at some point, I think it was a Game Shark code that gave you access to a bunch of debug maps, and there were, I think, hundreds of them. Some of them were actual maps in the game, others didn't exist in the game at all, at least accessibly. And each map also had predetermined party members and monsters. I think there's also something about the code that let you control both the players and the monsters. And when my friend and I discovered this, we used to play that game in versus mode, essentially. We would enter the debug code, scroll through a bunch of the different options, find one that looked interesting, and then we would battle each other, with one of us using the hero characters and the other one using whatever boss or monster or enemy characters that map provided. Speaking of which, that very same friend and I once were playing Final Fantasy Tactics on the PSP many years later. We were doing some of the multiplayer modes, just hanging out someplace. It wasn't at one of our houses. I think we were coming back or going to the mall. And somewhere just along the way, we just decided to hang out under a tree and play some Final Fantasy Tactics. And while we were doing that, some guy was going up to a intersection with stoplights, and he swerved off the road and hit something. I don't think it was another car. I think it was like a power pole or something. Or like the pole that the lights are on. He hit something. He just swore. And we didn't. I don't think we really saw the full thing. I think we heard it and both looked up and saw this car just kind of turning off the road. And we don't know why it happened or what was going on. My guess is maybe something happened and he wasn't able to brake in time or something. And so he had to turn off the road to prevent causing a wreck or something because the light turned red. I don't know exactly what happened or what was going on with that, but it was just another interesting, I guess you could say it was interesting. It was just a thing that happened during a point when a friend and I just happened to be playing a Final Fantasy game together. And if we hadn't been doing that, if we hadn't taken a break to play that game for a bit at that spot, we wouldn't have even seen it happen. So I just thought, we're on the topic of Final Fantasy, that literally just came to mind as I was getting ready to end this video, and I thought, you know what, sure, let's just throw that in as one last little closing bonus. So with that, we're going to end this off here. Next time, we will resume the Marsh Cave. Things are not going well at the moment, it seems. I have 2 stunned characters because of those obnoxious crawl enemies. They don't do crap for damage, but they can paralyze you, which makes them a total pain. So, we will resume the Marsh Cave, and I will pick back up this topic as well. Like I said, I have some more stories to go over in regards to Final Fantasy, my experiences with it, and so on. So, we'll be doing that, continuing this topic into a second episode. So with that, if you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you've seen YouTube enough times to know the things to do. Like, subscribe, all that, blah, 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 blah. And I'll see you next time.